Yeah, you clicked for Bill Cipher, didn't you? Well, I'm here to tell you that I tricked you. Now you have to listen to me talk about Victorian society and crappy 2000s CGI for the next hour. Or you could just click off this video, but I do actually talk about Bill Cipher for a bit at the end, so maybe stick around? I promise this video is at least a little interesting. Alright, so Flatland, A Romance of Many Dimensions, is a novella written in 1884 by mathematician and theologian Edwin Abbott. Yeah, you heard that right, 2 Abbotts. I wonder if he ever called himself Edwin Abbott squared or Edwin A squared. I'm not so sure about that second one, but you know who is called A squared? Well, square. The main character of Flatland, so let's get into that. Flatland follows the life of A Square, a square who resides in a 2-dimensional universe, and the events that follow when he comes into contact with a 3-dimensional being. The story is told in the past tense as a series of journal entries, which explains why A Square is able to document his experiences in a way that makes Flatland understandable to a reader from the 3rd dimension, since by this point he's already been there. Overall, the story is split up into 3 arcs. Number 1, the nature of Flatland, which accounts for the first 40% of the story. Number 2, the chromatist revolution, which accounts for the middle 20% of the story. And number 3, the revelation of multiple dimensions, which accounts for the final 40% of the story. The first arc of the book, well, isn't much of an arc at all. It mainly focuses on explaining the nitty-gritty as to how things work in Flatland. I won't go into too much detail with that since, well, it functions more for world-building purposes and isn't always directly relevant to the story. Also, there's like a lot of it, so here are the things you should know before we continue on with this plot. In Flatland, Flatlanders exist as different types of shapes. You've got the men, who can range from triangles all the way to circles, and then you've got the women, who are all lines. Well, technically they're really thin rectangles, but still, not much variation there. However, because Flatland is, well, flat, individuals can only perceive each other as lines. So in order to differentiate one shape from another, they've developed a multitude of strategies like the less invasive voice recognition method, since different shapes have slightly different sounding voices, the more invasive feeling method, where individuals feel each other's angles directly, or the more difficult sight recognition method of using changes in brightness within an individual's visible sides to gauge the type of angle that they have. This is all very important to know how to do, not just for daily functionality, but also because, well, Flatland operates under a very strict caste system, in which the more sides an individual has, the higher their standing in society, leaving us with something that looks like this. Women at the bottom, having only 2 sides, and then isosceles triangles, and then squares, and then pentagons, and then, well, a bunch of other higher-sided polygons, until finally making it to the circles, who reign at the top of society. The narrator doesn't get too into it, but it does seem that the accepted justification for this hierarchy is because higher-sided polygons have larger and presumably more intelligent brains, since the angles of their vertices increase with their number of sides. So, since Flatland is socially quite rigid, there isn't much room for mobility within one's lifetime. The only way to move up the ranks is to hope that the sons within a family are born with more sides than the father, which does happen most of the time, unless they're a triangle. Triangles only ever have more triangles, but sometimes they have an equilateral triangle, but then the government relocates the equilateral triangle to another family because isosceles aren't considered fit parents for higher ranking shapes, so that's kinda sad. Frankly, there are a lot of things about Flatland that are sad. For example, Flatland has strict laws about symmetry and equal-sidedness. Irregular shapes, which include what we might still consider to be neat-looking shapes like rectangles, trapezoids, or just normal triangles, are not allowed to exist freely and are forced to undergo reconfiguration surgeries at birth. Yeah, most shapes don't survive this procedure. There is some room for deviation, but if a shape is found to not have equal sides, they're either killed or forced to do isolated government labor. Because, yeah, they're actually just as intellectually capable as other shapes, it's just that according to the government, the accommodations it would take to allow them to exist freely in society are too inconvenient. Not to mention that they disrupt the caste system since they wouldn't fit neatly in the hierarchy. From one angle, they may look like a triangle, but from another, they may look like an octagon. Something else that's interesting about the caste system, though, is that although women and isosceles triangles are at the bottom, they're both actually totally overpowered because of how sharp their angles are. Since women are lines, they can puncture through a lot of things, including other shapes. The isosceles too, especially the ones with sharper angles. I think in general the caste system in Flatland is interesting. There clearly isn't much mobility allowed, and the fact that the triangles can only make more triangles feels to me like an allegory for the cycle of poverty. Not to mention the whole brain angle justification for the caste system feels very adjacent to the attitude some people hold that those who are poor are there because they deserve to be. They're just not smart enough to make it out and therefore belong where they are. And when it comes to women, yikes. So women can't work, and in some cultures in Flatland, they're forced to stay home altogether because their points are deemed too dangerous to the public. In the cultures where they can women leave, they're required by law to do a sort of constant wiggle so others can see them, as well as let out an intermittent peace cry to notify others of their proximity. They're also considered to have no ability to form meaningful long-term memories or exercise forethought. As a result, they're deemed reactive and impulsive, since they live exclusively in the present and can only respond according to what is happening around them at any given moment. Basically goldfish, but like really dangerous goldfish. To deal with this, the men of Flatland exercise caution around women by speaking to them in the dialect of emotion. And yes, this is considered an actual dialect in Flatland, one that men are taught to speak only around women, using terms like love and compassion, while using the dialect of truth and logic around other men. Which kinda reminds me of those toxic player guys who pretend to be feminist in order to get more girls, but you can tell they're just spewing jargon they saw online to seem more woke than they actually are, completely switching up when they're back with the boys.
Oh, my feminist literature books. Not my feminist literature books.
I know that's not what Sir Abbott was going for here exactly, but it's what it reminded me of a little, so I'm just mentioning it. Back to the story though, let's talk about what our main character, A Square, thinks about all this, since, well, the story is told from his perspective. When it comes to the caste system in general, he doesn't seem to take much issue with it on a surface level, but on a deeper level he does find its implications regarding the personal responsibility of individuals to be concerning. If an isosceles is inherently a troublemaker, then why does he get scolded for making trouble? And if an octagon is inherently intelligent, why does he get praise for sharing insight? If behavior is completely determined by one's angles, what's the point in teaching people about the proper and improper ways to act in society? As for the women, I think this paragraph encapsulates our narrator's thoughts best. Overall, he's pretty strongly biased towards Flatland ways of thinking, only deviating here and there. For example, he believes his own wife is intelligent, but he very much sees her as an exception to the rule. In addition, he finds the double dialect thing inconvenient, mainly because he doesn't think the benefits of having two manners of speaking worth the confusion young boys are put through when they grow up thinking that emotions are valid concepts, only to be told it's part of a ruse to placate women. Some of you hearing me talk about this story might be bothered by the representation of women here, and you wouldn't be the only ones. After Sir Abbott published this story, he faced quite a bit of backlash from women's emancipation groups and sympathizers who interpreted Flatland to be offensive. This sentiment even got popular enough that not long after, Abbott published a foreword as a disclaimer where he explained that A Square is a biased narrator and his revelation of the third dimension is supposed to go beyond just its literal geometric implications, also having social ones. Honestly, I'm kind of surprised people didn't catch this. Like, there are many instances in the story where A Square's perception of women is implied to be wrong. For example, he talks about how women have terrible memory and no foresight, but that's obviously not the case when they're shown to be capable of mobilizing themselves to join the chromatist cause. Not to mention the very obvious moment where A Sphere, the three-dimensional being A Square encounters later in the story, and an incredibly high-status being by Flatland standards, directly challenges A Square's views on women. Look, I'm not implying that this mathematician priest guy from 1884 was some slay queen feminist icon who didn't just foresee the fourth dimension but also the fourth wave of feminism, but I do think he clearly had a level of respect for women that was unconventional enough for the time that he thought it was okay to be satirical about it, since from his perspective, of course people would get that he wasn't being serious. And well, as I mentioned before, that wasn't what happened. But even with the addendum, people still didn't seem to get what he was going for. In the foreword to Sphereland, a Flatland sequel written in the 1960s, Isaac Asimov talks about how this unofficial sequel gave women a much-needed upgrade compared to the original. I'm gonna talk about that more later, but like, really, Isaac? I expected better media literacy from you. Unless he was referring to the status of women within the context of the world of Flatland, in which case I'd agree with him, but it seemed like he was talking about Abbott's views, which in that case, I think he missed the point. But that's enough on the nature of Flatland. Let's move on to the second arc in our two-dimensional tale, the chromatist revolution. So one day, a guy named Chromatistes found a way to turn the boring grayscale appearance of Flatland residents into a fun, vibrant array of colors. While viewed as a bit out there at first, the trend quickly gained traction to the point that even the highest classes were engaging in chromatism. However, some of the more conservative circles did not like this trend, for one reason in particular. Take a line and a circle and color each of them half red and half green. They look the same. Not from every angle, of course, but enough for it to greatly concern the circles, hoping to repress the trend before it gained too much traction. Unfortunately for them, though, the people caught on to the implications of chromatism just as quickly and mobilized into an active chromatist movement movement, no longer discussing chromatism as just a fashion trend, but as an equalizer, something that would allow for the merging of the classes and a more egalitarian society. As expected, a lot of the lower classes quickly jumped on board, including women. The oppressed seemed quite fond of this bill, and the leader of their cause ended up proposing the Universal Color Bill, which would make chromatism default in society. The circles, in a panic, needed to find some way to sway public opinion against the bill, and, in a risky move, started off the deciding debate by pretending to support it before gradually introducing some concerns they had for the safety of their people should the bill pass. Due to a recent tragedy in which a shape used chromatism to pretend to be another shape to, assault a woman, the circles convinced their subjects that chromatism was actually harmful to their wives and daughters. In addition, they were able to sway the opinion of the middle caste using fear tactics. So, as public opinion began to sway against chromatism, Chromatistes attempted to share his rebuttal, but was surprisingly held back by guards. It turned out that the debate for the Universal Color Bill never mattered to begin with. The circles just wanted to get the supporters of the chromatist movement in one room so they could kill them. So, unleashing their forces, everyone died, and the circles enacted an intense martial law for the next year to ensure that chromatism was no longer being entertained in any way. Honestly, despite this part of the story being the shortest, it was probably the part I was the most invested in. What can I say? I like me some political drama, in fiction at least. It's a shame it's excluded in most Flatland adaptations, although I do understand it definitely sticks out and is hard to make flow organically into the Dimension arc. Which, speaking of, let's get into that. It all begins when A Square falls asleep one night and has a dream about Flatland, a universe consisting of only one dimension. There, he encounters the king of Flatland, who upon hearing a disembodied voice speaking to him, is obviously distraught. A Square explains where he's from, but the king does not believe him. A Square tries multiple methods of convincing him, like passing through Flatland and even poking the king on his insides, but it's all futile. The king is so set in his ways that nothing will make him believe otherwise, and so A Square gives up and wakes up from his dream, only to have a very analogous encounter the next evening. As A Square is resting in his home, pondering the significance of his dream, he's interrupted by a circle. But wait, how did this circle get inside his home? There was no evidence of some sort of break-in. Well, it's because he's not a circle at all, but in fact a sphere named A Sphere, the circle a mere cross-section of his true form. A Sphere then spends the rest of the evening trying to convince A Square of the existence of a third dimension. Despite the various methods he employs to convince him, though, A Square only becomes panicked and asks A Sphere to just leave him alone. A Sphere, realizing that A Square isn't going to listen to him, decides to pull him out of Flatland altogether so he can experience the third dimension for himself. And with A Square tagging along, A Sphere makes an appearance in a meeting between the circles, to which they ignore him and kill all witnesses of the encounter, as it turns out they're aware A Sphere visits every millennia and will do anything they must to repress any knowledge of the third dimension. And so, knowing that A Sphere likely already visited some other Flatland citizen to make into his apostle, they quickly pass a law making any discussion of the third dimension illegal. A Square, while somewhat distraught by what he's just witnessed, still remains fascinated by his newfound understanding of the third dimension. Unfortunately, though, his eagerness gets him into trouble when he asks A Sphere to now take him to the fourth dimension. A Sphere feels insulted by this implication that there's a dimension beyond the third and throws A Square back into Flatland. In light of the newly passed anti-3D law, A Square holds back his newfound knowledge and tries to come up with a strategy about how he's going to reveal the truth of the third dimension to his peers. Unfortunately, however, his excitement precedes him, and one day at a meeting, he bursts into a spontaneous declaration of the third dimension, which promptly gets him thrown into prison for life. Even with A Square presenting the evidence, Flatlanders were too stuck in their ways to ever consider anything beyond their reality. 7 years later, we catch up to the present, where A Square shares that he's written these very entries so as not to forget what happened to him, lest he begin to think it was all his imagination. Anyways, I've never really talked about religion on my channel before, but considering that the author of this story was religious, I think at least a brief discussion is warranted here, so I'm just gonna paste my thoughts on screen for anyone who wants to read them. Overall, the story of Flatland feels more like a thought experiment and a political satire more than anything. There's really not much characterization going on here. It kind of thrives on concept alone, which, as an avid reader of science fiction, isn't uncommon, especially for earlier entries in the genre. And this can work when an idea is original enough. I'm willing to bet that at the time, a geometry-themed story about a two-dimensional universe was pretty unheard of. But as time goes on, it can make discussion a little bland, at least when it comes to other things we usually expect from literature, like characterization. I mean, if you haven't noticed, I haven't analyzed the characters in this story much because, well, there isn't much to analyze. This is definitely a story that gets its intrigue off of its premise, which is fine by me. As of this moment in time, I wouldn't be surprised if I'm actually one of Flatland's top 10 fans. But for those wanting a little more of a dramatic experience, I'm not sure you're gonna find it here. So now that we've discussed the source material, let's get into the stuff that came afterwards. Starting with Flatland, the film, an independent production directed by Lad Alinger Jr., who, before someone starts going off in the comments, I know he's a controversial guy. Look, I'm not gonna launch into a whole conversation right now about separating art from the artist. I'm just gonna put my thoughts on screen, and if you don't like it, then you can exit this video. Have you ever consumed a piece of media and thought to yourself, wow, that was made for my brain's exact neurological structure? Well, that's sort of how I felt discovering this movie. It's not perfect, but I honestly like that it's rough around the edges. I think it gives it a lot of charm. Like the original, in this version of Flatland, the caste system is pervasive. For example, A Square's son, a hexagon, thinks he's too good to play with his siblings because they're only pentagons, and even blames his father for not giving him more sides. In another moment, A Square argues with his brother, B Square, and upon mentioning their father, B Square brings up the fact that his opinion shouldn't matter because he was a triangle. Overall, it seems that in this world, there is a strong dedication within Flatland families to progressively increase the number of sides with each generation. So much so that parents are expected to revere higher-sided polygons even if they're their own progeny. To some degree, at least. Unlike the original though, the movie integrates its world building throughout the story, which, yeah, probably the way to go. I mean, just by virtue of the story being told in a visual format, it's a lot easier for the nature of Flatland to be conveyed organically, as opposed to having to share it through exposition. That being said, the movie is able to jump right into its first arc focusing on the chromatist movement. It's entertaining enough, albeit a bit accelerated, only taking about the first 30% of the film's runtime. I also think that without an understanding of the original Flatland, it's a little hard to understand certain aspects of the arc, like why the chromatist movement got so much traction in the first place, as well as how the circles planned its takedown. I also thought that having the leader of the chromatist movement be the only character in the whole movie with a goofy voice was not the best choice. It just felt like it undermined the significance of the movement, one that, mind you, was supposed to equalize society and allow for social mobility. A proposition like that should be presented more seriously, and having every character in the story sound relatively normal while this guy straight up sounds like King Candy was not the move in my opinion. In addition, this guy is pretty irregular, but it's shown in the movie that the process of reconfiguration for irregular shapes at birth is a thing, so I can't help but wonder how in the world this guy managed to survive long enough to become a politician. During this chromatism arc, the president has an interesting moment in which he contemplates whether he's doing the right thing. One of his supporters assures him that all great historical figures have to make difficult choices, to which he says that he doesn't care about being remembered as a great historical figure, he just wants to be a good person, which sounds very compelling until you remember that this is right after he incited a massacre on the chromatists, which is only the first of like 6 other deplorable things he does in the movie. Anyways, after that, we move on to the dimensional arc of the story, which takes up the rest of the movie's runtime. It begins with A Square having a dream about Lineland, and, just like in the original, engaging in an incredibly frustrating back and forth with the king of Lineland, only to realize that the conversation is futile and providing was probably one of my favorite lines of the movie.
You 6-inch idiot!
The following evening, A Square has his own encounter with A Sphere in which they have a similar conversation. A Square eager to just get this creature out of his home, not really willing to take in the evidence that A Sphere has given him to prove the existence of a third dimension. Eventually, A Sphere gets so fed up that he pulls A Square out of Flatland and into his world, but before A Square and A Sphere leave, A Sphere interrupts a meeting with the president and reveals himself, to which the president ignores him and then kills all the non-circle witnesses except for A Square's brother, who he mercifully only sentences to life in prison. A Sphere then takes A Square with him to Messiah Incorporated, the company which he is CEO, and seems to be responsible to some degree for the existence, or at least the continued existence, of Flatland. Yeah, this is where one of my biggest complaints with the movie arises. I feel like the whole Messiah Incorporated project regarding Flatland could have been explained more. Like, why did the public seem so adamant on getting rid of it? Was it wasting resources or something? And why do they have to wait 1,000 years to reveal the third dimension? I suppose this wasn't explained in the original story either, but I was sort of hoping that this movie, since it had more third dimension world building going on in general, was going to provide some sort of reason for that. As for A Square's fate, instead of getting thrown in prison like in the original story, the ending in this movie is different. Due to some corporate and political drama in the third dimension, A Sphere has to send A Square back to Flatland, where it gets destroyed by the chaos going on above. At least I think that's what's implied to have happened. Anyways, for some reason, A Square is the only one to survive, and while we don't know exactly what's going on here, it seems like he's contacted by some higher dimensional being, leaving the story a bit open-ended, which I suppose is nice, at least in contrast to the absolute tragedy of A Square's entire reality getting destroyed. But that's just the plot. I want to talk about some of the more artistic elements of this movie. First off, I really like the designs of the Flatlanders, like how we can see their organs, since that's how it was described in the novel, something that the other Flatland adaptations didn't really do. I also like the CGI in this movie. I know it's not objectively the greatest, but I think that gives it charm. Honestly, I kind of like crappy CGI in general. Can we please bring it back? Like, has it been long enough that this can be considered an aesthetic? Because I actually unironically want a movie or a show with just a totally oversaturated 90s 2000s CGI art style, but everything else would still be good, like the music and the voice acting and the story. Or actually, maybe it'd be more charming if like the music and the voice acting were also kind of off. I don't know though, maybe it's just my brain that likes these sort of things. Anyways, I genuinely like this movie. It's rough around the edges, some odd voice acting here and there, some really odd musical choices.
Let me go back! Let me talk to him!
Don't have a lot
Please,
of time.
he's my brother!
Your brother is expendable.
And some questionable pacing, but I don't know, what can I say? I like the novel, and I think this was an entertaining adaptation of it. But what if I told you it wasn't the only adaptation of it? That's right, there's another Flatland movie. A Hollywood-produced one at that, with the voices of Kristen Bell and Tony Hale. Yeah, I was not expecting that. So off the bat, in this version of the movie, women are not lines, but shapes like everybody else. Which, honestly, while at first this inconsistency with the source material did bother me, after some time I realized that it isn't really necessary to make the women lines if you're not going to tackle the subject of women as second-class citizens. The movie is far more focused on the third dimension plotline and foregoes a decent amount of the political stuff, even leaving out the chromatist arc altogether, or, well, since everyone is colorful, implying that the chromatist movement did succeed. Although it's more likely that this is just a Flatland in which shapes are inherently colorful since their insides are also colorful. Whatever, I'm getting sidetracked. Honestly, I think in general the original Flatland is known way more for, well, its mathematical concepts anyway, so I think it's fine for the movie to want to focus on those aspects of the story, although the caste system is still present here and does maintain some level of relevance throughout. Another thing about this movie is that it's only 40 minutes long, so the story is kind of sped up. We start off by getting some insight into Flatland society and A Square's life. He lives with his wife and granddaughter, Hex. Yeah, so here they made A Square's grandson from the original Flatland a girl who lives with her grandparents because her parents were killed for being third dimension conspiracists. Hex is very intrigued by the third dimension, but A Square discourages her from engaging with those ideas. However, that night A Square has an encounter with Lineland, and later an even stranger encounter with a sphere. Or should I say Spherius, this version's A Sphere, who after some fruitless bickering decides to pull A Square from the second dimension and into the third altogether. He reveals that a long time ago, third dimensional beings created a monument in Flatland to help reveal the existence of a third dimension. Said monument is located in an area shown earlier in the movie to be restricted from the public. Around the same time, Hex reads her mother's journals about the third dimension and this monument and decides to go looking for it herself. A Square then asks Spherius about the fourth dimension, which ticks him off and provokes him to throw A Square back into Flatland. The next morning, A Square is eager to share his experiences with his brother, but is interrupted by an announcement from government officials that the blocked off area has been breached. A Square, suspecting that it's his granddaughter, quickly goes after her, and they discover that the cube in the middle of the monument is really a portal into the third dimension. They go through it and meet up again with Spherius, who reveals that Hex, not A Square, is the true apostle of the third dimension. They then return to Flatland and share what happened, and then there's like a coup thing where the circles are overthrown. It's not the most tightly plotted, but I'll save more of my thoughts on that for later in this video. And that's basically where this movie ends. Well, save for a teaser that reveals another part of the monument showing a previously unseen hypercube. Anyways, from an artistic standpoint, while I found the designs for the Flatlanders in the indie adaptation more interesting than the ones here, I did quite like the visuals for the 3D world, and I also like the interdimensional space A Square visits. I don't know, I just thought these little Mandelbrot creature things were fun. While I still stand by the idea that cheap CGI has its own kind of charm, I think objectively Spherius looks more polished here, and I like the animations for his expressions. Also, the musical and sound design choices here made a lot more sense, even if they weren't super noteworthy. So those were the two major film adaptations of Flatland. But there are actually a few shorter, lesser known adaptations I found online that I thought might be fun to discuss as well, so let's get into it. So this short film was made in 1965 by Harvard's animation division, which I didn't know they had. Apparently, in 1963, Harvard had just established a visual arts department, and the guy they brought in as the animation professor, Eric Martin, wanted to make their first project be an adaptation of Flatland. It's a little rough around the edges, the voice acting is questionable, and the story is a bit rushed, but I really like the visuals, and I think it's worth a watch if you're curious about other adaptations of this story. Next up, we've got Flatlandia. Also, yeah, there was a bit of an issue when watching this adaptation since there were no English subtitles and
I don't speak Italian!
But I am at least moderately proficient in the other 3 Romance languages, so through the use of my multilingual knowledge and the persistence granted to me by my hyperfixative abilities, I was able to mostly understand this video. Not that there's a ton to say about it. From an artistic standpoint, it opts for pretty simple stop motion, albeit it does have some cool visuals at the end. And from a story standpoint, it focuses primarily on explaining how things work in Flatland. It isn't until the last 5 minutes that we touch on the chromatist and 3D story arcs. Now this film is pretty short and explores an aspect of Flatland that isn't mentioned much in other adaptations. The concept of equilateral triangles being forcefully rehomed into quote-unquote more suitable equilateral families, where they're prohibited by the government to ever engage with their biological families again. This short may only be 2-ish minutes, but it actually made me quite emotional, so props to the creator. And if it gets you emotional too, you should watch this video next. It's equally short, but pretty funny, where instead of A-Square asking A-Sphere to explain the 3rd dimension to him, he asks A-Sphere to instead help him rob a bank. Now, this short is a bit longer than the previous one and seems like some sort of educational animation feature, maybe to accompany a textbook or something. I'm honestly not totally sure, but it has this fully human superhero guy who finds this circle lady and tries explaining the 3rd dimension to her, which she sort of panics about since it's not something they're allowed to talk about in Flatland. So he pulls her out of her plane so she can understand what's going on. Yeah, I didn't love this adaptation. The human superhero guy contrasted with the simple looking Flatlanders was off-putting to me for some reason. And while I did like how the circle turned into a sphere upon leaving the 2nd dimension, why does she look like that? They couldn't have kept her blue. Also, the superhero guy never puts her back, so I guess she's just stuck in the 3rd dimension now. Oh well, moving on. The last adaptation I want to talk about is pretty long actually, a full 26 minutes, and honestly probably has my least favorite art style out of all of them, but it was made by one guy for a multimedia degree back in 2006, so maybe he deserves to be cut some slack. It's also completely 2D, even when A-Square leaves Flatland for the 3rd dimension. The voice acting is also a little odd, and there's no background music, which can make it feel a bit empty, but I respect the effort put into this. I don't think I'd recommend it to other people. There's probably better things you can do with 26 minutes, but hopefully whoever made this was able to learn something from the creative process. And that officially concludes the Flatland portion of this video. Now on to the sequels. Unofficial sequels, that is. Sir Edwin Abbott Square died in 1926, and this Flatland sequel didn't come out until 1965, so yeah, you can assume it was written by someone else. That being Dianus Berger, a Dutch physicist. In a writing and illustrative style similar to the original book, this story continues Flatland's tale from the perspective of A-Square's grandson, A Hexagon, 70 years after A-Square wrote his journal entries. As A Hexagon explains his modern-day Flatland, he documents how society has shifted since A-Square's days. The caste system, while still present, is less rigid, and in addition, women are held in higher regard, although there's definitely still some sexist sentiment. Interestingly though, unlike in Abbott's Flatland, this time it actually doesn't feel satirical the way the book talks about women. Like, I think this is just genuinely how the author feels. The same goes for some of the racist sentiment that comes across in parts of this book, primarily in the first half where A Hexagon talks about his country's exploration of the rest of the world. It's kind of hard to explain, you have to read it to know what I mean, but it just feels like it exotifies other countries and cultures in a little bit of a questionable way, but moving on. The novel does quite a bit more world building for Flatland, mostly in regards to the way nature works. Like, while humans are generic shapes like squares and hexagons, the animals look pretty funky, which, now that I think of it, may explain some of the stigma against irregularity. Like, maybe humans here consider their symmetry to be what separates them from lower life forms? Just speculation. Anyways, there are 3 major discoveries that occur in this book, the first having to do with the shape of Flatland, or at least the part of Flatland that the humans live on. Basically, when 2 explorers, Occidentalis and Orientalis, went on expeditions to the edge of the Earth in opposite directions, they actually found that they crossed paths. Using this information, Dr. Expert, a Flatland scientist, concluded that Flatland was therefore a disk. But if Flatland is a disk, then what's outside of the disk? Well, that's where world-renowned acrobat Aerosalta comes in. Through a catapulting system of her own design, she launches herself so high into the stratosphere that she's able to observe the existence of other disks. And so, Flatlanders have now become aware of the existence of not only their own world disk, but other world disks. Also, in this story, a hexagon has officially met a sphere and is now fully convinced of the third dimension. A sphere then begins a tradition of visiting a hexagon's family every year on New Year's Eve, and one day tells him about his own encounter with an oversphere, a sphere from the fourth dimension. He laments, however, that no one in the third dimension believes him regarding his experiences. The following year, he returns and flips over one of a hexagon's daughter's dogs in an attempt to explain the concept of mirror images and how they can be produced by flipping an object through other dimensions. But then, on his way out, I guess he felt a little whimsical and decided to conduct an experiment of his own on an actual person, flipping over a Flatlander. The poor guy ended up in a mental institution because to him, the world was suddenly inside out, and of course, people became concerned for him. He eventually adjusted, but had to learn how to write backwards and stuff like that. Not that a sphere was there to witness all this. He was too busy conducting another experiment with the oversphere on a fellow 3D'er to help cure their left-handedness by flipping them in the fourth dimension. Yeah, it ended up messing with their sense of direction so badly that they walked into a street and got hit by a car. A sphere should really not be allowed to conduct experiments. But back to a hexagon, one day a mathematician named Puncto arrived on his doorstep after being fired from his job as a navigator because he consistently calculated triangles with more than 180 degrees, which, well, isn't considered to be possible. A hexagon agrees to help him, and they start working together to account for this phenomenon. One night, a hexagon has a dream that, when zoomed out very far, Lineland was not actually Lineland, but Circle Land. This gives him and Puncto the idea that perhaps the space on which Flatland resides in is itself curved, and that perhaps their entire universe rests on the surface of a sphere. When they ask a sphere about this, he confirms their theory, but warns them not to share their findings so as not to risk being ostracized like he's been for talking about the fourth dimension in his world. They listen to him and keep quiet, Puncto slowly restoring his professional credibility over time. He eventually gets hired as a navigator for a space mission, only to come across yet another strange phenomenon. Every time he measures the distance between 2 points, they keep growing. He tells a hexagon about it, who then has a dream about an expanding circle land, which of course gives him the idea that they live on an expanding sphere. During a sphere's next visit, he confirms their theory and also shares that his own space is expanding, but in 4 dimensions instead. But sadly, due to the demands of his job, this is not a theory Puncto can keep quiet about, as it can have actual consequences on the space mission. Meekly, he presents his explanations to his superiors, who then fire him and get him blacklisted in the STEM community. He moves on, eventually finding a new career working for the IRS, but the two of them do feel quite disappointed that their theories aren't taken seriously. So, a hexagon decides to write a thesis that is only to be shared once their world is in a better state to consider their radical ideas, even if that isn't in their lifetime. As you can see, similar to Flatland, this story also ends on a bit of a sad note. I can't say the same for the movie though, and yes, this story was also adapted into a movie. So remember how I mentioned that teaser at the end of that one Flatland film that showed the hypercube? Yeah, well, that's because the creators of that movie intended to release a sequel, Flatland Squared, Sphereland, an adaptation of the Sphereland novel, with some adjustments of course. First things first, instead of a 70-year time skip, we get a 20-year time skip, where Hex is now grown up, although unfortunately, A-score has still passed. We're told that the Flatland caste system has now been dismantled, with all shapes having equal opportunity, but the revelation of 3 dimensions is unfortunately still rejected because the portal that Hex and A-score used in the first movie disappeared and Spherius never came back to visit them. This was a bit confusing to me considering the end of the first movie had the circles overthrown seemingly as a direct result of Hex and A-square revealing the existence of a third dimension which the circles had been hiding. My only assumption to explain this disconnect is that there was already a somewhat high level of dissatisfaction with the caste system, and the debacle with Hex and A-square was used more so as an opportunity to overthrow the circles. It wasn't necessarily that people were super excited about the third dimension. That being said, Hex, while still a mathematician, is unfortunately alone in her understanding of 3D and is sort of ostracized in her field because of it, until she meets Puncto, of course, who, same as in the book, is a navigator for Flatland's new space expedition. Except there's a problem. His data shows that the path the ship is set on, while intended to be a straight line, is actually curved. So he asks for Hex's help to figure out what's going on. She agrees, but is confused by his data and can't really figure out what's going on until, whoa, Spherius is back. He tells them about his encounter with the oversphere and how she got mad at him when he admitted that he ridiculed A-square for suggesting the existence of a fourth dimension, and as punishment flipped him over, completely reversing his perception in 3D. It's sort of confusing how this works at first, but then the gang, looking for a portal to the fourth dimension, revisits the King of Lineland and flips him over, completely altering his perception in the same way the oversphere did with Spherius. They also find out that Lineland is not a line, but a circle if you zoom out far enough. This gives Hex a theory that the plane of Flatland is actually curved, as if it existed on the surface of a sphere, which is exciting until they realize it may have fatal consequences on the space crew since it means their calculated trajectory might actually lead them to crash into something. So they head back to Flatland to save the space expedition. A little too late though. The crew ends up slamming into multiple asteroids and reroutes straight into a hypercube, which serves as a portal to the fourth dimension, where they encounter the Oversphere. Spherius apologizes to the Flatlanders for underestimating their theories, and the Oversphere, pleased with his character development, unreverses him. And so while the gang knows they could stay and continue their journey across dimensions, they decide that maybe it's better to focus on what they already have, and maybe, hopefully, be able to advance Flatland by teaching them about what they've learned on this adventure. Anyways, yeah, I like this movie, and the first one too, but I do have to say that it does feel like a standard Hollywood kids movie, not necessarily in terms of subject matter, but just like in the way the dialogue is written and stuff like that. It also feels like it was written with an educational intention, at least from the way it was advertised and how it continues to be advertised today. Like, there's a teacher pack you can buy with accompanying worksheets and stuff like that, and yeah, that kind of makes sense. This definitely feels like a movie a middle school math teacher would play on a Friday afternoon to hopefully prove to their students that math can be fun. And they'd be right. But the Flatland literary universe doesn't stop there. In 2001, a mathematician named Ian Stewart decided to make his own sequel to Flatland, Flatterland, which, yeah, is kind of a silly name. Here's a conversation I had with one of my friends about it. Unlike Sphereland, this book puts a more modern twist on the story, which can be best observed through its change in writing style, which, yeah, considering this book was published in 2001, I actually think that was a good choice from a selling standpoint. Although the diagrams and illustrations do retain the same art style as the original, which was charming to see. But let's get into the actual story. Flatterland is about a line named Victoria, Vicky for short, discovering A Square's old journal, the original Flatland, in which she deciphers a hidden message telling her how to summon a 3D being. And so, one night, she does. But while expecting to be met by A Sphere, she is instead met by some dude named Space Hopper. Space Hopper, or Hopper for short, is not only a being of 3 dimensions, but also a being who can hop through spaces. He equips Vicky with a device that allows her to space hop alongside him, Vicky eager to learn more about the 3rd dimension. But just as they're about to leave, her mom catches her vanishing into thin air, and her poor family immediately launches a missing persons investigation. But let's not worry too much about that. After all, the story is about Vicky's adventures across dimensions, going beyond the concepts mentioned in Flatland or adjacent books like Sphereland. Some of these were actually pretty interesting to read about, like how dimensions inside a computer program work, or how fractal borders can be considered their own dimension. And that's how most of this book is structured, each chapter taking Vicky and Hopper to some new sort of geometric world. I'm not going to list every chapter here, but I will say I think the topology and black hole chapters were my favorites. That being said, there really isn't much plot to track in this book. It really just functions as a way to talk about math concepts in a manner that is more approachable to a casual reader, explaining ideas through clever wordplay, oddball characters, and silly dimensional shenanigans, which is fun, but can make the book disappointing in some ways. After all, the original Flatland did have some sense of continuity and consequence to push the reader forward through the story. This book, even with a little continuity it does have, kind of squanders any opportunity to use it. Like I mentioned earlier, Vicky's family knows she's missing, and occasionally throughout the book will switch to her mother's perspective on the situation. In addition, Vicky mentions multiple times that despite the fun adventure she's going on, she's kind of homesick. But even with this going on, we never actually get to see Vicky reunite with her family. We know she does it because she mentions it briefly, but like, you can't just get a reader looking forward to a moment like that and then gloss over it. In addition, Vicky spends the whole book traveling with Space Hopper only for their parting to be completely ignored. Like, they have this nice moment where he shows her that Flatland has a shadow dimension called Flatterland where women's polygonal forms reside, their appearance as lines in Flatland only representing one edge of a more complex shape, and it's a really exciting moment for Vicky, but then she just goes home. We don't get to see her part with Space Hopper at all. No see you later, no thank you for the adventures, nothing. It just undermines the friendship they've supposedly developed over the course of the story. The ending instead focuses on Vicky deciding to start a women's empowerment movement, helping them uncover their hidden dimensionality. So I guess while I did enjoy this book as a math enthusiast, I do feel like it was lacking in plot and characterization. And that's Flatterland for ya. But wait. There's even more! I mean, as you can already see, Flatland made quite its impact among the STEM community, with many authors of different professions deciding to tell their own Flatland or Flatland-adjacent tales. In 1907, Charles H. Hinton, the guy who coined the term tesseract for a 4-dimensional cube, wrote an episode of Flatland, which is about a plane world called Astria and its people coming to accept the existence of a 3rd dimension and the ways in which you could help save their world. It's also longer than the original Flatland. In 1963, Norton Juster, the guy who wrote the Phantom Tollbooth, wrote a charming children's book called The Dot and the Line, A Romance in Lower Mathematics, which 2 years later was turned into a really charming short film that won an Academy Award for animation. In 1983, Rudy Rucker, an American mathematician and computer scientist, wrote a short story called Message Found in a Copy of Flatland, in which Flatland turns out to be a real place in the basement of the school Abbott used to run, although now it's a restaurant and the owner is trapping people inside of Flatland and stealing their money. So if you haven't been able to tell so far, Flatland is no stranger to fan-created continuities, which actually gave me the idea to check out the fanfiction behemoth itself, Archive of Our Own, for some additional Flatland content. Okay, so as of writing this portion of the script, there are 64 fanfictions for Flatland, 42 of which are crossovers with other fandoms, mostly Gravity Falls, and 2 of which are explicit, which, while I'm not sure how uncomfortable and I quote, hot vertex on vertex action could actually make me, since they're, they're literally just shapes, I'd still rather just skip those. So that leaves me with 20 true Flatland fanfictions, 12 of which I got permission from the authors to talk about. So this fic is the longest one that exists on AO3 currently for this fandom exclusively, and wow, I was not expecting to find something like this, but I'm really happy to see it. The story begins with A Sphere learning about the fourth dimension and returning to Flatland to apologize to A Square for dismissing his theories. He then asks for A Square's help to better understand what's going on, the following chapters diving deep into Riemannian geometry, a non-Euclidean branch of the subject, so yeah, it's a pretty math-heavy fanfiction, but cool nonetheless. The next one is a short fanfiction of the indie movie where A Sphere finds a way to turn A Square into a cube. Honestly, shout out to this fanfic for giving an explanation for the 1,000-year rule. Essentially, the way the author explained it is that Flatland is so thin and frail that any visits occurring more often than 1,000 years would risk tearing their world, which, yeah, I'd believe something like that. Okay, so this one is also a fic of the indie movie that's written in a screenplay format, except this time it's told as more of a drama than, well, however the movie talked about it. I don't really know how to categorize the tone of that movie. You kind of just have to watch it. Now, this one was a series of one-shots about an irregular triangle growing up in an experimental facility. It was pretty sad, but frankly not something I couldn't imagine happening in Flatland. Now, this one is a bit longer, and it's about a woman in the millennium prior to the original Flatland who's chosen as the apostle of 3 dimensions, but ends up taking some drastic measures to spread the message. It's not a completed fic, but it's advertised to give some lore as to how the caste system in Flatland came to be, as well as some other modern day features of it, which from what there is so far, I can kind of see where it's going. Now, this fic is essentially a swap AU of the indie movie where A Sphere is now A cube and A square is now A circle. There aren't many chapters of it, but what I read was pretty fun, and apparently it was based off of this fanart. Now, this one is a short postscript added by A Sphere to A Square's Flatland to detail his own experiences meeting an oversphere and learning about the fourth dimension. It retains a similar writing style to the original Flatland, which I thought was charming. Also, apparently the author wrote this as a math assignment, so kind of funny that I'm talking about someone's math homework in a video like this. Now, the last few fics are all one-shots written by the same author. This one is for the indie movie and only about 1,000 words, but it's really good. I feel like I can't say too much given its length, but the premise is that A Sphere gets banished to the 0th dimension, and let's just say it presents a very interesting theory regarding Pointland. Now, this one presents a short but entertaining interaction between the King of Lineland and the King of Pointland, and is continued by this fic, but with a bit of a twist at the end regarding the King of Pointland and his understanding of the universe. This one describes a visit with A Square in prison from the perspective of his brother B Square, and wow, I mean, the ending of Flatland is bleak, but this definitely added more angst to it. And the final one I'm going to mention explores the perspective of A Square's son and wife after he gets thrown in prison. It's not very long, but it is fun to see what happened to A Square's family in the aftermath of his sentence. That was something I always kind of wondered about. Honestly though, after reading these Flatland exclusive fanfics, I was actually curious about some of the Gravity Falls crossover ones, since at the time of making this video, I'm rewatching the show, and I don't know, some of these actually look pretty good. There's this one about Bill Cipher discovering the third dimension through A Square's journals. I mean, that sounds fun. And then there's this one that's almost 250,000 words. I haven't been able to read the whole thing as of writing the script, but from what I've seen so far, it utilizes a good amount of material from both the original book and the indie film, so yeah, it definitely seems like a crossover fic that goes beyond just, hey, Bill is from Flatland, so let me just put this fic in the Flatland category too. Not that there's technically a problem with that, but don't catfish us Flatland fans like that. Honestly, after looking into some of the connections between Flatland and Gravity Falls, I can't help but reconsider some of my own opinions regarding Bill Cipher's character. In a video I made a while ago about 2D villains, not literally 2D, I mean in terms of characterization, I talked about how I liked that Bill didn't have a tragic backstory backstory because I think it makes him more fun as a villain. I suppose I still believe that to be true, but I'm gonna be honest, ever since the Book of Bill dropped and gave us some more insight into his past, I actually don't think I'd mind if it turned out that Bill had a bit more complexity with his backstory. There's this moment in Flatland where A Sphere mentions needing an eye in one's stomach to be able to perceive the third dimension, which is ridiculous to A Square because something like that would be useless to him. Flatlanders need to have an eye on their sides. But when we look at Bill, he does, in a way, have an eye in his stomach, which allows him to look upwards and see the stars, while everyone else probably thought he was blind and imagining things. It adds some interest to Bill's upbringing, and seeing fan interpretations of what may have happened with him and his home dimension has made me come around to the idea of him being a more complex character. I mean, he's still fun either way, and truthfully, I am kind of a sucker for angst. And so, if you've made it to the end of this video, thanks for sticking around. Hopefully you've learned something about the Flatland literary/cinematic universe, and maybe have even decided to check out some of this stuff for yourself. I'll even put some additional recs on screen for those who are really invested and want to check out even more Flatland adjacent media, so pause if you need to. And that's that. Jules signing off.